Okay, well, welcome everyone to this evening's meeting of the Berkshire Ornithological Club. Tonight is one of the highlights of the indoor programme. We have a jointly organised meeting organised by University of Reading and the BOC. But before we get on to that, just a few announcements to make. We have a new member, Stephen Heathcote. So welcome to you if you are listening tonight, and we hope you have a long and happy association with the club. And also welcome to members of the East Berkshire RSPB group. I know there's some of you tuned in tonight as well, and anyone else who's listening to this as a guest. The club has its photo competition on the 17th of March. There are 3 categories: birds in Berkshire, to reflect the kind of year we had last year, birds in flight and action, and portraits. And for each of those categories, you can submit up to 5 pictures. They don't have to be pictures taken in recent memory, but they do have to be digital. And the closing date for submissions is 5th of March. Okay, so I think that's all the announcements. Recent records, I can kick this off with a few birds I've heard about. I know that there are a few oyster catchers arriving in the county. They're very early spring arrivals. There was a snow bunting up on Berry Down a couple of days ago. At Fleet Hill Farm, a jack snipe has been reported recently. There are still crossbills in Swinley Forest, white-fronted goose at Padworth Lane, and some interesting gulls. At Moor Green, there was a little gull that flew through one late afternoon. The next day, Caspian gull, and that was there for two evenings. And perhaps, if this turns out to be true, more interesting and rarer is the Russian form of the common gull, subspecies Heinei. But that will probably take a bit of convincing for the records committee. So has anyone else got any interesting observations from recent days? Yes, Ralph, you're on mute.
I had a ruddy shelduck on Tuesday, Lower Pennington Lane, showing well.
Okay, that's nice.
I was there with Bert and Alan, see it as well, so the 3 of us see it.
Okay, lovely. Not exactly in the Reading area, but still nice to see.
Well, yeah, it's in the Berkshire area. Cheers.
This is Pennington on the Hampshire coast.
No, sorry, not Pennington. Sorry, Lower Padworth Lane. Sorry.
Right.
Get
Lower
that
Padworth
right.
Lane.
Yeah.
So
Looking
just
at some
south of the
records of mine.
A4.
Yeah. Sorry about Lower Padworth Lane.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Any more? I can't see any other hands going up. Okay, so let's carry on, and I'm going to hand over now to Chris Foster.
Thanks, Robert. I've been asked to introduce our speaker this evening as, I suppose, the university person. Organising is the loose word for this meeting for this year, but technically helping to organise this meeting. And it is a huge pleasure for me to introduce Campbell Murn, who will be our speaker this evening. He's had a very long association with the Hawk Conservancy. I don't know if he'd like to say how long, but if he'll forgive me, I'd like to read this little factoid from their website, which I do enjoy, which said that he once found a book on falconry in a second-hand bookstore, found the address for the Hawk Conservancy in the back, and wrote in asking for a job. And fast forward a number of years, I suppose, he's now the Director of Research for the Hawk Conservancy, a recognised expert in raptors, especially vultures, influential raptor conservationist, and also now a lecturer at the University of Reading. I was going to say here at the University of Reading, of course, not physically there. So many strings to his bow, and we're very lucky to have him here speaking to us this evening on vulture issues, various. So over to you, I think.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. The one thing you didn't point out from my little bio from the Hawk Conservancy Trust, they asked for what you consider to be your greatest achievement. And
Yes.
I said, tricking my wife into marrying me. That was my greatest achievement, I always think. So, but anyway,
Very good.
so still here. That was a long time ago, and I knew nothing about falconry or anything. I was just wrote to the Hawk Conservancy Trust on spec. At that time, I'd recently moved from Australia, just within a few months actually, and I was coming from a background of habitat management, mainly to do with rivers and the interface between river channels and the riparian zone, and all the wildlife that live in that area. So it wasn't just birds or mammals or insects, it was the whole suite, the old ecosystems that live alongside rivers. So yeah, I didn't know very much about birds of prey at that time. I liked them, of course, along with all other predators, but no, that was, as you say, Chris, many, many moons ago. So we went through all the technical issues, and what I'm going to do now, hopefully, is share my screen. Sally's given me permission, which was cause of some consternation before. I could see she was nervous, but I just thought she'd, get past that. Let's try. So can you all see that? Great. I've got a thumbs up from Rob, so we're in business. Good. Okay, so we're going to make a start. So yes, as Chris said at the introduction, my principal gig is Head of Conservation and Research at the Hawk Conservancy Trust. But I've recently, in the last couple of years, become a part-time lecturer at the University of Reading. I've had a long association with Reading. I did my master's degree there many, many years ago, did my PhD there, and have been visiting research fellow for, I think, 3 or 4 years, and just in the last couple of years as a part-time lecturer, just convening one module but chipping into others and that type of thing. So that's me. If anybody wants to contact me, I'm probably more responsive from this email address here. I do check my university email fairly regularly, but this is one of those annoying ones that seems to be in contact with me all the time. So yes, as Chris pointed out, I'm going to be talking about vultures. I hesitate to call myself a specialist or an expert. I'm certainly not either. Oh, well, I'm a specialist, but not really an expert. I don't like that term, mainly because we all know that X is an unknown quantity and a spurt is a drip under pressure. So I prefer not to use that term, but I do spend a large amount of my time, not an awful, because I quite enjoy it, a huge proportion of my time looking at vultures, and specifically some species more than others, but vultures, yes, seem to be the area where I am channeled, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about that in a moment. So the talk's going to be in 2 parts. So I'm going to start the first half, as it were, with a bit more of a pictorial and a bit more of a conservation-y type angle, talking about a critically endangered species and the conservation efforts that are going towards trying to solve that problem. And then we have a break, and then we're going to come back for part 2, and that's where the exciting bit begins, because there's an element of audience participation here, and I have it on good authority that Sally has a poll ready. I'm going to put up this slide now, and here's the chance for the big vote. Don't be put off by the really dry titles, because they're very exciting talks, and I'm sure you'll all be champing at the bit to see them. But these are the choices of your talks. The first one on the left there is a method to look at estimating global populations of species using a protected area network. And this one on the right-hand side of your screen is basically looking at what affects our ability to detect raptors in this case, but birds in general when we're doing surveys. And this was a kind of proof of concept type of study. So this is your choice. So you can pop it into your point of consideration. I'm not sure, Sally, when you're going to put up the actual poll, but this slide will come up again at the end of the first talk. So just pop that into your mind for now, and then you can have an active choice as to what you'd like to see later on. They're not particularly long talks, either of them, but I think they're more of a methodological type, ornithological studying birds type conservation angle, rather than this first talk, which is going to have more pictures and more information about birds and conservation. So that's the objective, to split it down the middle. And there'll be time for questions as well, if anybody's inclined to ask. Okay, so I said I spend a lot of my time looking at vultures, and indeed I do. And lots of people say, why do you look at vultures? And we get that question a lot from our visitors who come to the Hawk Conservancy Trust. Now, ordinarily, we would have about 60,000 visitors per year to the Hawk Conservancy Trust, which is great because that gives us a big opportunity to reach lots of people, talk about the work that we're doing, but also share really valuable information about not just vultures, but birds of prey in general, and by extension, the habitats and environments where they live. I'm sure we all know here that birds of prey are particularly interesting from a conservation point of view because they're apex predators. They're at the highest level of the trophic pyramid. So they're very good indicators of what's happening in the ecosystem underneath, as it were, the lower trophic levels. So usually I put this slide up in a couple of different parts, but I've just put it up in one job today. So mainly I look at vultures as a biologist because, and I should point out, I'm not an ornithologist. I should point that out, even though I'm talking to an ornithological group, I'm a biologist who works on birds. And to me, there's a very big distinction between the two. Of course, I love birds, but I'm a biologist by background. So this is the Serengeti, as you may recognize, and it's one of the most spectacular ecosystems on Earth. For those of us that people have been lucky enough to visit there, you can perhaps even seen this spectacular migration of these ungulates and herbivores that move back and forth according to the rainy seasons in East Africa. And what we look at here are these groups of vultures. And it was estimated quite some time ago by one of the people who did the seminal work on vultures anywhere in Africa, actually, and chose the Serengeti, and that was Professor David Houston from the University of Glasgow. And some of David's work was based around the rate of consumption by vultures. And he estimated that vultures in that ecosystem in Serengeti in East Africa, they consume more dead meat than everything else put together apart from blowflies, which is an extraordinary contribution to ecological function. And what we're seeing now is the numbers of vultures in Africa overall, and particularly in East Africa, decline. Spectacular environmental views like the Mara crossing, when all these wildebeest are crossing the Mara River and they're being attacked by crocodiles or drowning or whatever, and the carcasses are filling the river. Historically, they would have been eaten by the suite of scavengers that live there, and none more so important than vultures. But with fewer vultures, there's fewer mouths to feed, and there's more and more carcasses lying around. So if you take a keystone scavenger out of an ecosystem like the Serengeti, what ends up happening is that lots and lots of carcasses lie around rotting and being eaten by blowflies, which isn't much for the tourism industry. So they have this important, hugely important ecological function, the keystone scavengers of the vultures. And so the next one, by extension, of course, are these implications for disease ecology. Now, I'm very quick to point out that some of my colleagues actually who work on vultures and vulture conservation, they're very quick to hold up vultures as the pin-up group of organisms that suppress disease and stop us all dying from anthrax. But the evidence base to support that is non-existent. I'm sorry to admit it, pains me greatly, and it's something that exercises my research time and thought process a lot, is how can we demonstrate? It makes sense, of course, you take a keystone scavenger out of an ecosystem and there's lots of dead animals lying around, it makes sense that disease ecology is going to be affected, and no doubt it is. What we don't understand yet is the extent to which diseases that exist in these ecosystems what are the epidemiological consequences of taking keystone scavengers out of an ecosystem? We don't fully understand that yet. And as I mentioned earlier, vultures are really good indicators because they sit at the top of the trophic pyramid, so they're subject to these concepts we're familiar with, like biomagnification, but they're very good indicators sitting at the highest level of the trophic pyramid. So there's three really good reasons, biological reasons, to look at vultures. Another reason is this. So there's 23 species of vultures across the world. There are 9 of them that are critically endangered, 3 endangered, 4 are near threatened. And what that means is that around about 70% of all the world's vulture species either have a poor or very poor conservation status, and that makes them the most threatened group of birds in the world. Now, the parrot people want to stick up their hand at this point and say, hang on a sec, or then there's some other groups that might want to champion the cause, but the reality is that if we look at the red list, the category of endangerment, vultures are the most threatened group of birds in the world. So if you put those two things together, these 3 key features I just mentioned here and their level of endangerment, it makes sense. We should all be looking at vultures. Highly endangered, important for ecosystem function, and really good indicators. So it makes sense that we spend a lot of time looking at vultures. So for any students that are listening, at this point, I'm going to depart from the lecture that you would ordinarily be getting in either Dr. Holloway's lectures or Dr. Baker's lectures. I'm going to be talking to you about vultures there too. So anybody who's interested in vultures, you've certainly come to the right place. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on this set of figures here in the publication that they come from, which is by Darcy Agata and colleagues. It was published in 2015. And a lot of the time, people hear these terms, endangered or critically endangered or near threatened, and they conceptually realise what it means that these species are in deep trouble. But there's metrics that we use to measure this, and really in terms of vultures and how we categorise them as either endangered, which is this blue dotted line here, or critically endangered. In this particular case, it's the rate of change or the amount of change in their populations over 3 generations. That's one of the metrics that the IUCN Red List uses, is the amount of change over 3 generations. So if you're a population and your population has decreased by 50% or more over 3 generations, or is predicted to do so over the next 3 generations, you classify or categorised as endangered by the Red List. If your population's decreased or predicted to increase by more than 80%, you're critically endangered. And we know the next step, of course, is extinct in the wild. And if you look here, these bars in the middle of this figure represent the rates of change, the average rates of change in southern, northern, eastern, western Africa of the bearded vulture, Egyptian, hooded, white-backed, repels, Cape vulture, white-headed vulture, and lappet-faced vulture. And you can see that with the exception of the bearded vulture, almost all of these species have classified recently as critically endangered because these monumentally high rates of decline. The repels vulture by a staggering 97%, white-headed vulture by 96%, which means, of course, that they're very, very close to extinction. So why has this happened to Africa's vultures? I go into this in a lot more detail in other talks. What you can see here, here's a pie chart. I don't particularly like pie charts, but they're very good for putting up key information. And you can see that poisoning accounts for just about 2/3 of why African vultures are dying. And then we have this around about 1/3, which is trade in traditional medicine. I don't like that term, traditional medicine, because it's not medicine, it's witchcraft, it's hocus pocus. It's people smoking vulture brains to think they can see into the future. That's what it is. It's not a medicinal purpose. It's using animal parts for the purposes of magic. So if we put those two together, and bearing in mind that a lot of vultures obtained for muti trade or the juju trade are obtained by poisoning, we can see that poisoning is killing Africa's vultures in the same way as poisoning is killing everything else in Africa. Same publication, Darcy Agata and colleagues. And here it is here, published in Conservation Letters in 2015. And it was a clarion call for vultures in Africa. And it led to these 4 species here, white-headed, hooded, white-backed, and repels, been classified as critically endangered. Prior to that, there were elements of threat, but they weren't listed as the category prior to extinction. You can see a big bunch of collaborators there. And the important part about this particular analysis was it was a continental scale analysis from Morocco to Cape Town and everywhere in between. One of the outcomes of that paper was this multi-species action plan, which we call the MSAP. And that was also similarly a collaborative process, and in this case, across the entire African Eurasian range of vultures. So it was operated and convened under the auspices of the Convention of Migratory Species, which gave a global level impact. And this particular convention is one of the reasons why some of our research is being considered for impact assessment, because of its ability to reach at the global level and also the grassroots level. So the MSAP, the Vulture MSAP, was adopted in 2017. And it basically, in short, although it's quite a longish document, dry in these conventional ways, it provides a roadmap for African Eurasian vulture conservation out for the next 15 years. And like I say, it was adopted in 2017, but the fact that it was coordinated under the auspices of the CMS was a really big deal. And there were workshops in South Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe, several workshops in Africa, not in North or South America, because we're talking about a different group of vultures. But it really was a global collaboration of people that worked together to produce this document. And deep within the bowels of the Vulture MSAP, oh, pardon me, I've got another slide first. This is where I plug the Hawk Conservancy Trust, because prior to the Vulture MSAP, we'd recognised at the Trust the threats that vultures were facing, and we've been working on them since the late 90s, recognising the threats that they were facing, particularly for the topic of this talk, the vultures in South Asia. So I've broken this down into very bite-sized pieces, because that's what my board of directors likes. They like short, brief, be bright, be gone, is what they say when I'm giving a talk. So what is the IVP? It's conservation. Well, you can read the slide there. And so it's breaking it down into these. What is it? Why are we doing it? And I've already explained this bit here. What are we doing? So it's a combination of conservation breeding here in the UK, but also in South Asia. We do a lot of field work, a lot of research. We implement these actions, which is a key part. So the basis of the departmental philosophy at the Trust, my department, is evidence-based conservation. So and this is something that I really hammer into the students at the university as well, is that we have to have evidence before we can really decide what we're going to do. And we have to use evidence to assess what we're doing to see whether or not it's actually working. I won't get into the nest box argument or discussion, for example, but there's lots of examples throughout the world where people have done conservation techniques, but actually haven't spent any time testing to see whether or not they work. So that's a huge part of what we do. We need to understand more about vulture ecology, use this to improve our conservation management techniques, and in this particular case, excuse me, increase the capacity of our in-country partners. So here's a map from the MSAP, and it shows this is the signatory map, so the different colours represent countries that are or are not signatories to the CMS, but I've just used it here to highlight the project areas for the International Vulture Program. The bulk of the field work is focused in Southern Africa and, in this case, Pakistan, and then we have a big element of conservation, breeding and education here in the UK. There's a large number of project species. They're all vultures. So here we have the African ones, the white-backed vulture and the hooded vulture here, probably still the most numerous of Africa's vultures, with the exception of the very odd but very charming palm nut vulture, which probably isn't going to be called a palm nut vulture for very long. Taxonomic work showing that they really are quite different to other vultures. The critically endangered white-headed vulture and the lappet-faced vulture, the king of African vultures, which, despite its fearsome appearance and huge size, is actually a bit of a sissy. But never mind, they're still the king of African vultures. I'm particularly fond of this bird. Their Zulu name actually means the one who fights with a blanket, because when they come into a carcass, they use their wings to bash the other vultures around. So that's their name. I won't try and pronounce it in Zulu because it's, for me, unpronounceable, but it means the one who fights with a blanket. But we're not talking about lappet-faced vultures today. We're going to be focusing on the Asian vultures we have as part of the IVP. So top right, left rather, is the Asian whiteback vulture, once upon a time called the Oriental whiteback vulture, which is a misnomer. Long-billed vulture, another gyp species. Probably the most numerous old world vulture now, the Egyptian vulture, and the fantastic red-headed vulture, which is an Egyptian vulture, quite closely, although they're all monotypic, these Egyptian vultures, the white-headed lappet and the sarcogyps, the red-headed vulture, they all share a lot of characteristics and similarities in morphology, if not plumage. We have a lot of partners. I won't go into too much detail here, but you'll be pleased to see that a lot of them are zoos in the UK that have vultures as part of their conservation education program, and they contribute directly to supporting the work of the IVP. We have partners in the USA as well, France, some European partners. This list has grown a little bit since I made it, so it's contribution by zoos in Europe and some in North America to direct conservation activities. We also have a lot of collaborators, people on the ground. You can see the universities here, but there's some key government organisations and also other universities as well. So it's a big effort. It's not just the Hawk Conservancy Trust, and we make a big effort to collaborate with as many other people as we can and organisations. Getting back to the MSAP, like I said, it's a long document, and deep within the bowels of the MSAP is what I call Table 6. Now, Table 6 contains no fewer than 120 separate actions directed towards vulture conservation. There'll be more bird pictures in a minute, I promise. And all the actions within the MSAP are colour-coded. So red for research, B for policy, purple for policy, green for conservation action. And what the MSAP does, like I said, it's a roadmap, and it tells us the specific action that needs to take place, who's responsible for it, and where it takes place in the MSAP range. And what I'm going to be talking about today, or for this first talk rather, is objective number 2, which is to recognise and minimise the mortality to South Asian vultures from these anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs. The key way of thinking about it is veterinary drugs, which are toxic to vultures, so that the animals that the vultures eat, domestic livestock mainly, get treated with these drugs, the animal dies, and then the vulture eats it, and then it dies from poisoning. And I'll go into that in some detail just now. But that's really what this objective is set up to address. And this particular one here is to prohibit or withdraw some of these drugs. They give them names, they say what they're used for, and they say who's responsible for removing them and where it takes place. So this is across Africa, Eurasia. These drugs, diclofenac, which is the main culprit, ketoprofen, aceclofenac, they need to be removed and replaced with a safe drug called meloxicam. So, moving on to specifics of the conservation project that we operate with our main partners, WWF Pakistan, the Pakistan Vulture Restoration Project. And here's a magnificent Oriental whiteback vulture, or Asian whiteback vultures they get called now. So just a bit of quick recap. Not everybody's familiar with what I like to call probably the greatest disaster to have ever befallen the natural world. So this is what vulture populations used to look like in South Asia, not very long ago, really, probably in this was actually taken, this picture, in the 1980s. It's at a slaughterhouse in India, and this was a scene repeated time and time again across the Asian subcontinent. Open air abattoirs, tens of thousands of vultures occurring at each one. And for that reason, vulture populations were more than likely artificially high. We don't know exactly how many vultures there were in South Asia prior to their decline, but the best estimates are, and we have fairly good estimates, are the tens of millions of birds, tens of millions of these large-bodied scavenging birds of prey. When we get back to the ecological function we were talking about before, let's just make the numbers easy. Let's just say that there were 10 million vultures, probably more, but let's just say there's 10 million vultures in South Asia in the 1970s and 80s. Each one of those birds needed to eat about half a kilo of meat per day to keep going. That means you've got 5 million kilos of meat lying around every day uneaten. That's yesterday, that's the day before, and that's tomorrow. So you don't need a slide rule and a protractor to figure out, if you take 10 million birds like this out of an ecosystem, what the consequences are. And they've been significant, but not particularly well measured. What we do know is there was around about, because there's 3 species involved, about a 99% decline across South Asia from the 1990s. These are the 3 species: bengalensis, which is the white-backed, indicus, the long-billed vulture, pardon me, the Indian vulture, and tenurostrus, which is the slender-billed vulture. So there were lots of local extinctions and declines of around about 40% per year. And when you've got a classic K-selected species, which is a long-lived, late-maturing, slowly reproducing animal, if you have declines of the order of 40% per year, that's completely catastrophic. That's a nuclear-style evaporation of these birds. And not surprisingly, this led to an international conservation effort. The primary cause was this veterinary drug called diclofenac. The problem was it took around about 9 years before the cause was identified finally by Lindsay Oakes and his team in Pakistan. Lindsay sadly is dead now, possibly made one of the greatest contributions to conservation of birds in history when he identified that this was the cause of the decline. It was quickly confirmed by Suzanne Schultz and colleagues in India, and then rescreened from Cambridge, the very detailed but essential modelling to show such a small number of cattle, which is what the vultures were eating, that were treated with this drug. You only need a very, very small number of cattle be infected with diclofenac to cause the observed decline. People were sceptical. People were saying, surely this diclofenac wasn't everywhere, but Rees and his team showed you only needed about 1 in 250 cattle to be treated with diclofenac to cause these 99% declines. Super important work, amazing work, and done under incredibly difficult conditions. Importantly, meloxicam was identified not long after as the safe alternative to treat cattle, safe for vultures, and so the conservation effort is about removing diclofenac and replacing it with meloxicam. Proving rather difficult though. So the Pakistan Vulture Restoration Project, here we are back on the bite-sized pieces. I'll go through it fairly quickly, but what we're doing is, well, the reason for why is very obvious. We have this technical partnership with WWF Pakistan. We train and advise WWF staff, and we do field support, analysis, publicity, we raise funds. And the aim is to maintain a conservation breeding centre in Pakistan, replace these unsafe drugs with the safe ones, implement vulture safe zones, and then when the environment is safe, we can start to release these birds back to the wild. We're not going to be able to restock the population to what it was, which was very, very high. What we can do is maintain the safety net population, and then when the environment's safe, we can release the birds back to the wild. That's the medium-term aim. Here's the breeding centre at Changa Manga, which is just southwest of Lahore. It's around about 40 miles southwest of Lahore. Changa Manga is the name of the forest where the centre is located. Changa and Manga were 2 famous bandits that used to roam in the area, actually, and the forest is named after them. So it's a large facility compared to what you might see here for aviaries. This is quite large. This is some of the original birds that were basically rescued when the population was in free fall. These 40% declines of wild vultures, nobody knew what was happening. We just knew that the vultures very quickly. So there was an emergency situation, really, of trying to bring as many of these birds into captivity as possible until we could find out why they were dying. And then the aim, of course, at the same time was to start the birds breeding. You can see a nest basket here. and then start breeding them so we could maintain a population, because again, we didn't know how long we were going to have to keep these birds safe before we could release them back to the wild. And here's just some more pictures in the aviary. I think it's important to see just how big it is, but it's important to realize that in situations like this, there was no other option, and we face the very real risk of these birds disappearing entirely without breeding centres like this. There's one here in Pakistan, there's several in India, there's a few in Nepal, and they really were the backbone of the safety net for this species. I show this because all the white backs on the birds. One of my more esoteric questions is, why do whiteback vultures have white backs? You think about that for too long, it'll start driving you crazy, which has been doing to me for the last few years. Why do they have white backs? Why don't all vultures have white backs? How come you can't see them white back from below? How come you can't see it? Anyway, before we go down that wormhole, I'm happy to receive theories on why they have white backs. This is what it's all about, of course. This is obviously a chick that's been bred. I can't remember what year this one was. The vultures themselves, so these are the parents, obviously, and the aviary supervisors on the roof of the aviary taking a picture of this young chick. You can see it hasn't even started to show its quills yet. So this is the level of familiarity. Vultures are highly intelligent birds. They recognise situations. They're very good at problem solving, and they become familiar with their keepers very quickly and stay nice and relaxed. It's a nice baby picture as well. Here we are again. This is another year. It's being a little bit more protective. The key thing is that they've got a number of different nests. This is the juvenile from the year that's waiting to fledge. And the birds here in the centre have been breeding since 2014. So the colony is gradually growing. And just this year, we've started to look at opportunities to release some birds, pending some more surveys to test the availability of the unsafe drugs in the environment. So that's the captive facility, which, like I said, was essential to the effort. Hand in hand with that is work going on in the field. And so at the other end of the country in southeastern Pakistan is the province called Sindh. And there's what's called a Vulture Safe Zone. This is a conservation model which has been used rather from the beginning of the conservation effort in South Asia. And the idea is that around residual populations, breeding populations ideally, of these birds, we set up a perimeter basically of around about 100 kilometres. And the idea is that within that perimeter, all of the unsafe veterinary drugs are removed. It's not logical or feasible to look at the entire subcontinent because it's huge, as you recognise. So the priorities had to be directed towards the areas where the residual vulture populations existed. And at the time, there was a breeding population of around about 15 pairs of white-backed vultures in this area of Pakistan. And so that's where the Vulture Safe Zone was established. And the aim is to set up the zone and then clear the area. This is it in map form. Is Pakistan here, and down in the southeast is the study area, and the Vulture Safe Zone itself. You can see the perimeter there by these villages. I put this map up in an international conference once, and I caused an international incident by getting the boundary wrong between India and Pakistan. Now, we all know that they're not seeing eye to eye on lots of things at the moment, India and Pakistan. And no word of a lie, within 5 minutes of putting up the slide, there were very large sunglassed men who appeared at the back of the auditorium and stood there with their arms folded. And I really thought I was going to be escorted to the, I don't know what, the old bill. Anyway, so there's the Vulture Safe Zone. It's quite amusing afterwards. I just played the dumb Australian and it seemed to go okay. So, right, so zooming in further into this area down here, which you can see in yellow, is the what's called the Karunjar Hills. And the red dots here is the small breeding colony of white-backed vultures. The long-billed vultures breed in the hills because they're a cliff nesting bird. The white-backed vultures are tree nesting birds. And this is the type of landscape we're talking about. I can't go there because I'm the wrong sort of person to go there. They tell me it's a highly sensitive area, security issues, they're close to the boundary with the international border with India, and there's lots of security issues, even for my colleagues in WWF Pakistan who find it difficult to go there. My closest colleague, Jamshed Tradri, he's been going there for many years. He's been doing his PhD there, so he's familiar with the landscape. But it is remote, it is very dry, as you can see, and we have the long-billed vultures here on the cliffs and the white-backed vultures nesting in the trees. So there's a great, very photogenic, these birds, beautiful bills, and they're very pale talons as well, but these are on par size-wise with something like a Cape vulture or a Rappel's griffin. These are the heavy hitters and one of the most numerous, not quite as big as a Himalayan griffin or a Himalayan vulture, but larger than the white-backed vulture. And like I said, they nest on these cliffs. Like all vultures of this size, they just have one chick. Sometimes they might only raise 2 chicks every 3 years. They have very low reproductive rates. One of the problems, and this is a sad irony of the situation. So in the Burunjar Hills, you have this plant which grows, which is called Google, and it's a type of camphor bush, and the sap that comes out of these particular trees is used for the Indian Ayurvedic medicine system, which is one of the oldest medicine systems in the world. And the sap from this particular plant forms the basis of many of the medicines. It's like you add specific medicines to it. It's like a carrier. It's like you use it to make up the tinctures and so on. The problem is, Google as a plant, if we get back to the graph I was putting up before, as a population has decreased by around about 85% over the previous 3 generations times, which means that this plant itself is critically endangered. Sad irony I was pointing to is, or leading to, is that this plant grows in the Burunjar Hills. So people like this fella here go up into the hills, harvest unsustainably Google plant, disturbing the critically endangered vultures while they're unsustainably harvesting a critically endangered plant. And so the cycle goes around and around. Very, very difficult situation to rectify. There is moves towards trying to grow this plant in a cultivation scenario, but it is very slow growing. The next best step is to figure out how to convey to people. You don't need to chop the tree down. You can actually harvest it like a rubber plant. You've probably seen those where they cut the rubber plants and they draw off the sap. Same thing can be done with Google. It's not being done. It's easier just to chop down the tree. So the Asian white-backed vulture, here's the slightly smaller bird. You can see the nest in the top of the tree there. And these are some of the data from the area of the Vulture Safe Zone. So when we first started looking at them seriously in 2011, there were just 11 nests. And then 2012, they grew to 19 nests. 2013, 27 nests. 2014 nests. 34 nests. We thought, fantastic, this is going gangbusters here and the birds are improving. But then, subsequent to that, the numbers started to decline again, to the point where this year and last year, no white-backed vultures nesting in the Vulture Safe Zone in Sindh. The long-billed vultures are still there, but the white-backed vultures have gone. We don't suspect that they've died. We suspect that they've moved away. A tree nesting species like the white-backed vulture can go wherever they wish, so long as there's trees, but the breeding habitat for the long-billed vultures is spatially restricted, so they can only nest on the cliffs and commute to where the food is. And we think, in the extensive drought in this part of Pakistan, much of the livestock has been moved away, and the white-backed vultures have moved away as well. Some of the other problems, though, that these birds face within the Vulture Safe Zone, which would be repeated in many parts of the bird's range, is they nest in, obviously, trees. And here's the chick of the year, the 2 parents sat by. They're dedicated parents, vultures, fantastic birds. This is what happens. It's a drought area. There's not much fodder on the ground. So what people tend to do, the livestock herders, that tend to lop the trees, feed livestock, usually goats, and this is the result. So you have a nest, people lop the trees, and then the nest attempt is disturbed, and the vultures think, well, not much point staying here, let's move away. There's also ongoing mortality. Sometimes we find the birds long after they've died, so doing a post-mortem and understanding the cause of death is not possible, but there is still ongoing mortality. But the key factors is education. Here's one of my colleagues from WWF Pakistan. She's doing an online video here, but school visits, setting up nature clubs, outreach to the community, and imparting the understanding of the importance of vultures in the ecosystem, both for ecosystem health, but also those ecosystem services that I was talking about before. So there's been 15 nature clubs at different schools set up within the Vulture Safe Zone. And like anywhere else in the world where conservation is underway, outreach to younger people is certainly the way of the future. But there's also still hope for the adults. So there's capacity building and the local stakeholders and understanding of livestock management. And this is the key part of the Vulture Safe Zone activities in Sindh. Most of these people you can see in this photo are involved with livestock one way or another. And well digging as part of the activity to increase irrigation to grow crops for their livestock so they don't have to lop the trees. Also improved welfare of the livestock overall. And that's where some of the pharmaceutical companies become involved. So ICI Pakistan has been a big support for the livestock management camps. This is one of the key techniques we have. So this is not directly aimed at vultures, and this is an example of an indirect conservation technique. People use the unsafe veterinary drugs, diclofenac, even illegally if they have to. They use the unsafe veterinary drugs to treat their livestock when they're poorly. This project aims to stop the livestock getting poorly in the first place by improving livestock health and livestock management methods so that people don't have to use the veterinary drugs. And that's the roundabout way that the vultures are being protected. So there's livestock health camps, there's people learning how to basic animal welfare, which in Pakistan, there's no animal welfare legislation, there's no regulations, and in many cases, welfare is compromised. So when people have understanding of basic welfare techniques, they don't have to use drugs, it costs them less, they have better livestock outcomes, they have better livelihood outcomes, and we have better conservation outcomes because the vultures aren't exposed to the dangerous drugs. So we're doing annual pharmacy surveys. There's no veterinary diclofenac found anymore in the Vulture Safe Zone, which is really encouraging. It's just a case of getting the new drug meloxicam, getting the uptake as much as possible or as high as possible. I put this photo in just because I think it's funny. I used to put sponsored by Disney because the Disney Wildlife Foundation used to support this project. And I just thought with the camel there expressing his displeasure at having the wormer stuffed down his throat, I thought it was quite amusing. And if you've ever been near a camel when they're in a bad mood, you'll know exactly what this scene would sound like. So it's quite amusing. And the donkey's just laughing, or the cattle laughing in the background there. So in Sindh, in the Vulture Safe Zone, I like this picture, the beautiful long-billed vultures on the cliffs there. There's a large number of national level and provincial level partners. All of this work is delivered through the Parker Foundation, which we fund and is managed by WWF Pakistan. And these other two drugs here are now, by government decree, restricted within the Vulture Safe Zone. And the next step is to get the whole safe zone gazetted as a protected area. And last year, not last year, the year before, we wanted to take steps towards testing the actual carcasses that are in the landscape to see whether they contain any of these unsafe drugs. It's one thing to survey the pharmacies and look what's available. Work has shown across South Asia that people use these drugs illegally, which is one of the reasons why vultures keep dying. And then at the other end of the country, so this first, I don't know if you can see that little inset map there, the first Vulture Safe Zone was down there in Sindh. This one here is in the far north, or not the far north, but the north of Pakistan, where there's another residual population of white-backed vultures breeding. Very different landscape, very moist, in the foothills of the Himalaya. Pharmacy surveys were done there, and unfortunately, diclofenac and aceclofenac and ketoprofen, the three most dangerous drugs, were widespread in all of the pharmacies in this area. Encouragingly, the meloxicam, which is the safe drug, was also widespread. We're not quite sure what the use of the drugs is, and we're also not quite sure why the vultures are persisting in an area where there's a lot of diclofenac. We suspect it's because they're not actually eating domestic livestock. We suspect it's because they're still living on wild ungulates. You can see a very different landscape where these vultures are persisting. And here's one of the nests in the trees there. Very difficult to survey and actually remarkably difficult to find, even though this is quite a large nest. White-backed vultures aren't really very good at building nests. They tend to build rather small ones. So finding them can be very, very challenging. So we're calling this provisional vulture safe zone because, like I said, still lots of the unsafe drugs in the zone, and we're currently looking for funding to develop another community-based organisation to deliver the conservation work about getting rid of the unsafe veterinary drugs. And I think that's that one. That's the first talk, and now for the big vote. Sally, are you going to let it off the leash?
Would you like to do it now so that we should we get the vote done before break?
I've been waiting the whole time. I've given this talk and everyone's getting itchy. I think they've got their finger on the trigger.
Okay. I'll launch the poll now. Those of you who've been on the on our AGM and so on will know what to do. If you can, you should get a screen up that gives you two options. Wow. So please now vote. If there are two of you at your connection, would one of you like to put a note into chat? Just say 1 or 2 as the two options, and I'll add those on. I think, Campbell, can you see that the voting?
I should have. You know what I should have done, Sally? I should have done a Mentimeter, which is what I do in the lectures, and then you can see it popping up on the screen. Well, I should have done that. I do it when I lecture the students, but I must have had a brain fart or something. I don't know why I didn't do that. I'm sorry.
Well, 31 people have voted, so 31 connections have voted so far. I'm just looking to see if there's anything in chat. No. 37. Another 20%. 80% have voted. It's pretty close at the moment. Can I encourage the rest of you to vote? Because at the moment it's neck and neck.
Well, like I said, Sally, some form of democratic process is all that's required. So.
And why not? Yeah, good idea. Oh, we're getting one. We're getting a slight lead now. Come on, there's another 7 connections out there haven't voted yet. Have you voted yet, Campbell? That's probably one of them will be you.
Yes, I did surreptitiously, so you wouldn't know.
I can't see who votes and how they vote. There's 5 who haven't voted yet. Nobody's put a vote in chat, so right, still 5 haven't voted. I'm going to assume if they haven't voted soon that we
would you like a drum roll or something?
Chris, feel free.
Yeah, I can do that. Probably hear that.
I will, unless I'll give a video about a couple of seconds longer. If you're not going to vote, then I'll stop the poll. Okay, let's stop the poll. So the results are, can you see the results there?
Yeah.
Very close.
Protected area network, it is. Okay.
It is.
Are you going to tell us which way you voted?
No, I'm not. No. I should come clean here. Chris and I discussed, when I talked about this with Chris, I was going to talk about, I have a talk on spatial organisation of African whiteback vulture nests. And I have to admit, Chris, I opened up the PowerPoint this afternoon to look at it. And I thought, Good grief, what is that all about? I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember the talk. I can remember the topic, but I thought this is going to look bad if I try and give this talk. So I needed to go back, and it's all to do with fractal dynamics and all this sort of stuff. So anyway, so I've gone on the
I look forward to that one at some future date, maybe.
at some point. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
so we go for the
we-
white-headed vulture population.
Are we going to have a pause at this point? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
I'll get set up, and then I will.
I forget how long we usually have, Rob. Is it sort of 10 minutes?
Well, how
10
long
minutes,
do you want,
yes.
Campbell? 5 minutes
Yeah.
or 10 minutes?
I'm just going to quickly go and just
Let's,
go to the playground, and then I'll come back.
let's say 5 minutes then.
Okay. Yeah.
All right,
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Good. Okay.
Are you ready to carry on, Campbell?
Something wrong. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. All right.
Jolly good. Thank you.
I've done something to my screen. I can't see anybody anymore, but anyway, maybe that'll help. Right, so yes, using Africa's Protected Area Network to estimate a population of a threatened, and then after I'd done this, it was critically endangered, the white-headed vulture. And you can see I've got a number of collaborators here, including colleague Graham Holloway from University of Reading. And rather like I pointed out before with the MSAP process, this is a study that incorporated people from all across Africa. You can access the paper if you like, the references there. And I just put this up because it's a number of methodological.
We can't see the slides at the moment, or I can't. Is it me?
Oh, needy.
No,
Right,
you're not
okay.
sharing.
Okay.
Campbell, you need to share your screen again.
Okay. This is where I went wrong. Exit minimized video, share screen. How's that?
That's looking good.
Brilliant.
You could have told me earlier, Chris. Right. So anyway, as I was saying, colleague Graham Holloway from University of Reading and participants and colleagues from as much of Africa as possible. You can access the paper here. It's in Ecology and Evolution. It's a few years ago now, but I do this talk because it's one of a number of methodological talks that I have, which I hope can contribute to the way that we do either surveys or population estimations or whatever it might be. So when I talk, if I give this presentation to a conference, I usually say to people, I don't talk for very long, and there's a sigh of relief that goes through the audience when I say that. I tend to emphasize the take-home messages. So like that beginning slide, I put my collaborators and acknowledgements up the front. And here are the take-home messages for this talk. One is that there's only about 5,000 white-headed vultures left in the world, which is quite an alarming statistic. It should be reasonably straightforward to reassess this in X number of years from now, provided we follow the same methodology. And I think that's a key part for everything we do when we're surveying, is to make sure it's repeatable so that we have meaningful comparisons between one time period and the next. But the other one is that's not always entirely obvious. I think it's really important to try and link road transect abundance data with nest data. I think we do that because road transect data tend to be an index, so they show us how much change there is from time to time, but it doesn't link it with actual abundance, with the actual numbers of the animals that interest us. So that's one of the messages for this talk, is to link those road transect data, particularly for birds, with nest data, so actual numbers of breeding birds. So just coming back to that paper I mentioned earlier from Darcy Agata and colleagues, and this figure here basically just shows us the change in 3 vulture species, their populations, based on road transect data between the 1960s and 70s and the 2000s in protected areas, this one here, and non-protected areas. So if we look, for example, at hooded vultures in West Africa in the the grey bar is the 1970s, and the terracotta coloured bar is the 2000s. And we can see that these levels of abundance in protected areas decreased between the 60s and 70s and the 2000s. And looking at different species, we can see that some have been far more dramatic. So if we look at non-protected areas for lappet-faced vultures in West Africa, they used to be quite numerous, relatively more numerous, and they've almost completely disappeared outside protected areas. Same for white-backed vultures. And these were some of the other data that underpinned the Continental Crisis vulture paper that we published in 2015. This particular talk, and like I said, is about magnificent white-headed vulture, which is not really a vulture, as I'm fond of saying. It's more like an eagle masquerading as a vulture. It's far too colourful to be a vulture, and it's far too aquiline in its habits to really be a vulture. Fascinating species, monotypic, which means they have their own genus. They're sexually dimorphic, and what's particularly interesting for those of us who are interested in raptors, it has what's called reversed sexual dimorphism, which for a bird of prey is most pronounced in very predatory species. So RSD is where the female of the species is larger in one or more metrics of body measurement compared to the male. And white-headed vultures have that. And general rule of thumb with RSD, the more predatory the species, the more pronounced the RSD. Not only that, they're sexually dimorphic. They have plumage dimorphism between male and female white-headed vultures, which is unique amongst African vultures, and in fact, European vultures as well. The red-headed vulture, as I mentioned before, has some plumage dimorphism too. So that's really unusual. This is a male we can see flying here. The females have a window of white secondaries, white inner secondaries there. Makes them very easy to distinguish in the wild. They have a distinctive breeding biology in terms of the way that they share duties at the nest. So they actually partition their parental effort temporally. So if you look at the breeding effort that's put into a nest by a pair of white-headed vultures, the actual amount of time they spend between male and female is roughly equal, but they do it at different times of the day, which, as far as I'm aware, is completely unique amongst other vultures and even birds of prey. And they have this unusual feeding ecology, which is they're predatory. So they catch live things. They catch mongooses, they catch lizards, they catch all sorts of things, unlike other vultures. They're really weird birds. Fantastic, but a bit weird. They also happen to be critically endangered. So prior to this study, the state of knowledge for birds, for white-headed vultures was pretty limited. There was an estimate from 1992 of between 7,000 and 12,000 birds. And we had these spot counts from different parts of mainly Southern Africa, a little bit of East Africa. But it was all pretty sketchy, mainly based around national parks, and not really anything that was comparable. Just this picture here, you can see there's the female on the edge of this enormous nest. A lot of these are red-billed buffalo weavers that have added to the nest, but the vulture nest itself makes up about 2/3 of this tree. Fantastic position, beautiful lookout. This is magnificent male with his full crop there at the nest with the female. What we do know, though, what we didn't know a lot about white-headed vultures is that they restricted to protected areas. And here's the boundary of a protected area in Southern Africa, where you can see this river here, but you don't have to look too closely to see where the national park is versus the settled area outside the park with lots of communities and people living there. And you can see the landscape changes is dramatic and very obvious. And we know white-headed vultures have this association with protected areas. In fact, they're only known to breed inside protected areas. They sometimes occur in transitional zones. They don't breed outside protected areas. We don't fully understand why, but we're in process of trying to understand that. So, visual summary, they don't breed outside national parks, they breed in them, and then they use these transitional zones, possibly for going from one area to another. So what that means is we can use the network of protected areas once we have a good density estimation and understanding of how vulture numbers vary inside the protected areas, and we can use the protected area network to estimate their population. And that's what we did here. So we used the World Database on Protected Areas, which is this amazingly detailed map which shows all the gazetted protected areas. Some of them are accurate, some of them are not. So obviously this one's not shaped like a big square or a rectangle. Others in different parts of the world or part of Africa are far more detailed. So what we did, we selected protected areas by the type that they were and also their size. So we had only selected those larger than 250 square kilometres, which is slightly bigger than what a single pair of white-headed vultures would need to be breeding. And then we put a buffer around them, around vulture territories of about 100 square kilometres, and then another 50-kilometre buffer around that too. And all these data are freely available on protectedplanet.net. It's an amazing resource. There's so many free access data now. It's amazing. So we selected the different types of protected areas. This sounds fairly straightforward, but actually there's a very long list of protected areas from which you can choose. There's funny ones like game reserves are very obvious, but classified forest, what does that mean? I don't know, but we didn't look at them because we were unsure about their category status and how protected they actually were. Obviously didn't include wetlands or World Heritage sites. We chose these ones which are generally associated with wild or semi-wild situations where wildlife is, if not managed, like it might be in a game sanctuary or a game reserve, certainly not excluded like it may be in some of these other areas. So how do we work out the nest density though? I mentioned that once you've got a good nest density in a protected area, how do we do that for each protected area? Here's a female white-headed with her chick. One of the ones we captured during or took a photograph of during the aerial surveys. So one of the points that we had to start from is from a very well-known, certainly in raptor circles, but ornithology in general, is Jean-Marc Thiele, a French ornithologist active mainly in West Africa, but also East Africa throughout the 60s and 70s, and even to the present day. And Jean-Marc conducted tens of thousands of kilometres of road transects, particularly in West Africa, and gave us some of the first estimates of transect abundance of a vast number of raptors. We had all these road transects, mainly from West Africa, but also East and Southern Africa. We didn't really have very many numbers, didn't really have very many data on numbers of nests in protected areas, and this was the big limiting factor. So to solve that problem, what we did was we took one of the largest protected areas in Africa, Kruger National Park, which is about the size of Wales at about 20,000 square kilometres. And we did helicopter surveys, and we figured out that we counted around about 50 white-headed vulture nests in the entire Kruger National Park. And then we overlaid that onto about 30,000 kilometres of road transects in the same park, which enabled us to compare the abundance of known number of nests with the abundance that was observed during the road transects. Fairly straightforward, really expensive. Helicopters are really expensive. And we chose during our road transects to have them 2 kilometres wide, so 1 kilometre either side of the road. Not always possible, of course, due to the vegetation. We could estimate the age ratio data. Here's a juvenile white-headed vulture. They're fairly easy to distinguish. From the helicopter surveys, we could figure out how many birds were breeding, and we could figure out the consistency of the age ratio between years and across the park. And what that means is that if we counted 1.3 birds per kilometre, per 100 kilometres that should be, that's an error, sorry. We could calculate that backwards to look at the number of birds per square kilometre, and in this case, it's 0.0065 birds per square kilometre based on the transect data that we have. And then we do the correction for the age of the birds, the breeding attempts that we counted by the helicopter to work out that for every square kilometre in Kruger, we can estimate less than, well, 0.00263 nests per kilometre, which sounds an obscure number, but it's very helpful when we multiply it by the size of the protected area. And then we took those data, the relationship between the number of nests, the density of nests versus the number of birds observed by road transect. And we pulled in as many road transect data from multiple sources as we could obtain. And this enabled us to create regional density estimates for West, East, Central and Southern Africa. We modified it by country, so we went through the list of every single protected area, each individual protected area with local information, phone calls, emails, in some cases talking to people by person, to fine-tune these estimates based on the extrapolation from the breeding density and the road transect density. We didn't get total coverage, of course, we had to extrapolate. But what this is a method that's repeatable and able to be done the same way in however many years we want to do them. So the results are that of all the protected areas, around about 400 protected areas in Africa met our criteria for being selected, which represents just over 1.6 million square kilometres. And they had an average size of about 4,200 square kilometres. You're thinking, well, that sounds quite a lot. Not really when we look at the overall number of protected areas and the total area that they cover, but still that seems a fairly sizable portion of potential habitat for white-headed vultures. Just spend a little bit of time on this table, it's worth the effort, and there's some key bits of information. So based on the estimates from West, East, Central and Southern Africa, we selected these 400 protected areas. These numbers in brackets are to take account of some uncertainty, which I won't go into today. You have to find out about that in the paper if you're really interested. But the first take home is this number here, just under 2,000 pairs, that's nests of white-headed vultures in Africa. And the number of about 5,000 birds comes from, of course, doubling that number for each adult bird, or 2 times adult birds per nest, and then add a proportion for the number of non-breeding adults, again based on the road transect surveys, and the proportion of juveniles and immatures in the population, which gives us around about 5,000 birds. But this is the really important information here, that out of these 400 protected areas identified in Africa, over 300 of them were predicted to have fewer than 5 pairs. And that's really not a very safe or stable population. That's your classic meta-population of birds that are separated. The exchange of birds between different areas is probably quite low because they're separated by unfavourable habitat matrix, and also very, very vulnerable to stochastic or random events that could wipe out that population. Then you can see that protected areas with between 5 and 20 pairs, 20 to 40 pairs, and just 5 places in the whole of Africa where there's more than 40 pairs of white-headed vultures. And that's what it looks like on a map. Here's the areas here. They're all in East and Southern Africa, Kruger, West Zambezi, Selous, Ruaha, and I've just put Comoé National Park there. That fell into this category here, estimated to be about 28 pairs of white-headed vultures in Comoé. But you can see when we put the context of Africa as a whole in there, there's not much space for white-headed vultures, and they're also extraordinarily vulnerable to these local populations going extinct. One poisoning event, and that's that population wiped out with a very low probability of recolonisation. Oh, this is a rather boring table. I should have taken it out really, but this is giving, for those of you with a specific interest in a country, here's some of the size, some of the, all the countries rather, the number of protected areas within them, the size of those protected areas, and the estimated number of white-headed vultures. You can see here some rather large estimates for Zambia and Tanzania, which is a function of the very large protected area network in those countries. You could say it's an artifact of the calculation. So if you take out these 2 large numbers, you can see the number of white-headed vulture nests left in the world is really very, very small. But there are considerations and exceptions. Some protected areas will have been excluded or missed out through the selection process, which is understandable. And there's others that have been included that probably don't have white-headed vultures in them. So this is this area of variability that we have to account for, which is part of those numbers in brackets that I was talking about before. If we look at Zambia and Senegal, for example, where's Senegal there? So 24 nests. Zambia's got 400. Not sure why I put those up there. Not even the same sort of size. So that's a consideration we won't take home with us tonight. You can forget that one. What I'm saying is, though, is that the oversimplification of variation across a very, very large range of 5 million square kilometres, we've got a metapopulation, and densities of these birds are going to vary across this huge range. So it's not ideal, but in the actual fact, it's the best estimate that we've got that we can repeat, and we can monitor the change in this population over time. And the important point is we don't have to survey the entire continent to do that. So there's costs and benefits. So we have to have exceptions, we have to have oversimplification, but really without surveying the entire African continent, this is the best method we've had so far, at least, of estimating the global population of a critically endangered species. So just looking at some ways forward, I told you I wasn't going to talk for long, and it's getting close to my bedtime too. Small fragmented populations are highly vulnerable to stochastic events or random events, and any protected areas with fewer than 5 pairs, it's questionable how long they're going to be persisting. So the prognosis is poor for white-headed vultures in those small areas. Like I keep saying, the methods are repeatable in the future, but we still don't know enough about the movement ecology and dispersal of this bird, of this species, from the protected areas where they breed. They're obviously breeding, but we still don't know enough about the dispersal of the youngsters, and indeed what the adults do in the non-breeding season. What we can do, though, is look at and identify suitable rather, but unused protected areas. Now that we understand the reliance on protected areas by white-headed vultures, it may be that we can find a big protected area that doesn't have white-headed vultures where we could actually translocate some birds and increase this network of this metapopulation to try and add some level of security to the population as a whole. And that's it. I'm hot and bothered. I'm ready for discussion if anybody's got any energy, but that's the end of the white-headed vulture talk. Thank you very much for listening, and here's some of the people who helped contribute to that particular study.
Thank you, Campbell. Are there any questions, points of discussion, either on the first talk or the second one? I guess we can take them all together. Oh.
I can't see the
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
Whichever way you need to do it.
I've done something to it, Chris.
If you stop sharing.
Stop sharing.
There we go.
Campbell,
And then we can see
if
everybody.
it's-
There we go. I've got it.
Chris,
Yeah.
could I have a question?
Yeah, sure.
What's one quick one, simple one? What's the condition in cattle that diclofenac was used to treat?
It's a general painkiller. So
Yeah.
Diclofenac is ibuprofen class of drug. So
Yeah.
joint pain and elements of discomfort for the animal. So it's principally the problem in South Asia, particularly India, is because cattle are sacred to the vast proportion of the population. Most of the cattle that live there aren't bred for consumption. They're bred as either beasts of burden or milk cows or whatever they might be. So you have these really old animals that are getting towards the end of their life, and they go a bit lame, or they might get a sore hoof. And diclofenac used to be called the cup of tea drug. So if your cow, your buffalo, went a bit lame while it was ploughing the field for you, if you went a bit lame, you'd give the buffalo a shot of diclofenac, have a cup of tea, and by the time you'd finished the tea, it was good to go. So it's really, really effective. But as these animals got older and older, more and more health conditions, they got more and more diclofenac in them until one day they just dropped dead. People don't eat the animals. They get skinned by another group of people and then left for the vultures. So you've got this diclofenac-filled carcass that's being eaten by vultures.
Mm-hmm.
So if you ever take an ibuprofen, same class of drug.
Yeah, no, I find diclofenac a very useful drug, but I wouldn't use it now. I'm surprised to see that it's being used in parts of Europe now.
It's still registered and available for use for human preparations. And one of the bigger problems that has been
as a veterinary drug.
But yes, it's been banned as a veterinary drug, still available as a human preparation. And in South Asia, a lot of human preparation, diclofenac, was finding its way illegally, of course, into the veterinary applications. So that illegal use of diclofenac was an ongoing problem. It's been registered for use in Portugal and Spain, diclofenac, by, ironically, an Italian company who was involved with the original safety testing to show that it was dangerous to vultures. So Spain, the Iberia contains something like 80% of Europe's vulture populations, and they've registered diclofenac for use there now. So anyway, luckily no cases yet of birds succumbing to diclofenac poisoning, but hopefully it's going to stay that way.
Thank you.
Ian typed a question into the chat earlier, Chris. I don't know if you want to read it out.
Thanks, Ian. It says, what sort of total money is being spent to combat these declines, and are the Indian, Pakistani governments contributing, or is it being left to global conservation organisations such as the Hawk Conservancy to fund?
Yeah. Originally, the last bit. So RSPB have been huge funders of the vulture conservation effort in partnership with the Bombay Natural History Society in India. We've partnered with WWF Pakistan in Pakistan. Our contribution, we're an order of magnitude smaller in terms of the scale of the project and the money it's involved, but it has been and continues to be hundreds of thousands of pounds every year.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, at the beginning, that was a combination of RSPB, international NGOs like us, UK government through the Darwin Initiative gave hundreds of thousands of pounds or awarded. And most recently, in the last couple of years, the Indian government has started to contribute significantly. Still waiting for Pakistan to come along, and Nepal has had it's a different structure in Nepal than Bangladesh, but the funding streams from the government in those countries hasn't been very much. India's now started to contribute more, but it's taken 14 years.
Thanks. I think, Rob, you had a hand up. Yeah.
Yes, I'm just wondering, do the people in Asia and Africa value their vultures? I remember from one talk that, is it the Parsis that actually depend on the vultures for carrying away their dead? Yeah,
the sky burials. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, it's a changing situation. So in South Asia, yeah, you're right, the Parsis don't actually see the vultures as sacred, but they're essential for the sky burial process in the Towers of Silence. And sky burials aren't restricted to that Zoroastrian group. They're widely used in Central Asia by many different cultures. Particularly Himalayan vultures get used for sky burials a lot. The best of my knowledge, certainly in South Asia, there's no strong culture. Okay, historically in Hindi mythology, Jatayu was a vulture god who fought with another god to rescue a princess, and so in mythology and folklore, vultures have very powerful Hindi resonance because of their heroic status. In parts of Africa, different parts of Africa see them as sacred, and other parts they see them as not. So it varies significantly across the range. But I think the take home, Rob, is that they don't value them enough to make these big efforts that are required to protect them. That's the take home, really. Yeah. They date from antiquity. That the Egyptians had two goddesses based around vultures, and they were the goddess of childbirth. So they're often depicted hovering protectively over ancient Egyptian women giving birth in hieroglyphs. So they're very much sacred to the Egyptian. I can see Viv's hand went up. Viv's hand went up.
Yeah. Viv.
Okay. Could you tell us a bit more about the interactions when different species of vultures share a geographical area? Whether they compete or whether maybe you could restock areas with, protected areas with more than one species, and whether that would work?
That ecological question has been posed for decades now. So one of my mentors in Southern Africa did the seminal work on exactly that question. How is it that all these different species of vultures coexist in the landscape together? Now, there was some absurd theories, and I'd love to have an argument with anybody who's willing about these morphological differences between vultures. So the lappet-faced vulture with their big beak, that's like the can opener of the vulture world, and the vultures got divided into rippers, gulpers, and scrappers, all based around their superficial morphology, which is of course nonsense, because it smacks of altruism and this idea that all these poor vultures are hanging around going, gosh, I wish we could get into this carcass. Would somebody call the lappet-faced vultures, please, so they can open up this zebra so we can get a feed? And you can see how absurd it is if you stop and think about it for any length of time. But they do partition the landscape and the resources amongst them. It is partially to do with feeding ecology. It's also partially to do with biomass. So white-backed vultures, which are far more numerous, can actually outcompete almost every other vulture if they arrive en masse, and they dominate a carcass when they're there. So it's a combination of numbers. Feeding ecology's got part of it to do, but it's also a temporal division of time in the landscape. So these vultures don't all go out together each day. They don't all hang out at the waterhole wondering where the next carcass is going to come from. They have this temporal division of the landscape as in addition to spatial and in addition to a feeding ecology. It's a complex topic. Peter Mundy did his entire thesis on it, so it's fascinating. It's really interesting at the same time. I had an experiment. Can I just add something more there, Rob? At the Hawk Conservancy, we get all these visitors that come in, and I can't use it now because nobody's visiting because we're closed, but I made what I call a vulture piñata, and it's like a board with leather pads of different thicknesses on them, and I've made out of araldite, so it's really hard, different shaped vulture beaks, and the beaks are attached to dynamometers, so people can squeeze, and I can measure how hard they squeeze, and I can measure how hard they pull when they're using the fake vulture beaks to bite the leather, and see how much force is required to bite the leather or tear the leather, just so that I can shoot down Fritz Herzl's paper from 1976. That's how dedicated I am. So, but it's good fun, and the visitors get to have a go. Are you as strong as a lappet-faced vulture, or are you a sissy like a hooded vulture, and you can just sort of peck at the edge? I thought it was fun.
It's a definite incentive to visit when you reopen.
Absolutely. Thanks.
I also have a horrible feeling I might have to revise some of my slides for either a lecture I've already done this term or one forthcoming, but we can talk about that later.
We can talk about that later.
Yeah. Yeah, Peter.
I have a question.
I can't see who it is.
In the second part of the talk, you made the statement that if you could find any protected areas that currently have no white-headed vultures, then you're seeking them. But how will you go about seeking them?
How to identify them?
Yeah, do you contact the government departments or what? Yeah,
the first step is we're still in process with now is the inevitable modelling, the ecological modelling. So we have a lot of parameters from different parts of Africa through colleagues that work in different parts of the white-headed vultures range. So part of that work that we've done on white-headed vultures is developing a habitat model of suitability. It's not perfect, for want of a better word, but it identifies the key features of habitat
Right.
that represent the areas where white-headed vultures live. So we can use that model to identify areas in countries where we may not already be operating. And then the next step is, as you say, is to make the approach to the relevant conservation authority. It probably wouldn't be the government in Africa. You'd identify the key to like the BirdLife partner or a large conservation NGO or an organisation that's working already in conservation, and then you'd approach it through them. And then that would be the fun part, to say, well,
and then you have to fund the purchase of land, I guess, after that.
Well, the idea is to find existing protected areas.
Okay.
So it could be, I mean, there'd be areas from which white-headed vultures have gone extinct. And if we can find those areas, if they're large enough, there's potential to translocate birds from populations where we know they're as sustainable as they can be and translocate birds to those new areas, which would be really cool.
Yes.
You know how to do that.
Peter, see your hand.
Campbell, are any species of vultures successful or increasing or holding their own?
No.
None at all.
Well, sorry, I've been flippant there. Europe actually has had some good success with vultures. And so in particular, the Cinereous vulture, the bearded vulture, the Eurasian griffin. So there are some happy stories for vultures, but they're almost all located in Europe. Just recently, in the last couple of years in Nepal, we've begun to see the slightest indication that maybe vulture populations in Nepal are starting to increase again. Nepal's been extraordinarily successful in removing these unsafe drugs, and the Vulture Safe Zone concept was developed there. So they're probably 5 to 10 years ahead of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh in terms of their conservation. So there's some slight good news story from Nepal. Europe's got a lot of success stories. Sadly, I can't say the same thing for Africa.
There are some areas in India, though, aren't there, where they're having more success? We actually visited somewhere a few years ago when 3 different species were said to be holding their own.
Yes, there are residual populations, and I think the key really is what the rate of change is for those populations over time. So when populations like this get very, very low, assessing change either downwards or upwards, it has to be quite a significant change before you notice any change in residual populations. So those areas of India, and there are parts of Pakistan, parts of Bangladesh and Nepal, where the population is, as you say, holding their own, where there hasn't been dramatic declines. But any sign of recovery so far from the evidence we've got is restricted to Nepal. We don't have any good evidence yet that India as a whole, for example, is beginning to see much of a change.
So
but those data,
there are no lessons to be learned from European vulture populations or, say, Californian condors or whatever that could be applied to these more vulnerable species.
I might be unpopular for saying it, but the California condor thing, in my view, is a disaster and a conservation experiment gone wrong that's costing $2 million a year. So that's another topic altogether. You know, they have to catch up every single condor every year and treat it for lead poisoning because they didn't fix the problem to start with. The lessons from Europe are that with sufficient development, this is the key, really. So, you know, a strict enforcement regime where people are actually punished for poisoning vultures. Poisoning was the #1 problem in Europe, poisoning and direct persecution. So it's with these legal infrastructures in place that progress can start to be made. But still, even in Europe, there's still people who put out poison baits. There's still people who poison wolves. There's still people who retaliate when their livestock get injured, and vultures get caught in the crossfire. It's quite extraordinary when you piece together the European vulture conservation setting, the number of people involved, the amount of money involved, and the constant effort to maintain pressure to protect these birds. It's borne fruit and the populations are increasing, but the amount of effort has just been mind-blowing, really. and it's facilitated by strict regulation, really, and lots of and a huge number of dedicated people, of course. So it's, yeah. Condors are still getting lead poisoned, which is why they nearly went extinct.
I believe Trump supports them.
Yeah, really. Now he reversed the ban on lead ammunition. There were several states banned lead ammunition and it was reversed. So he rolled back a lot of environmental regulations that would have helped a lot of wildlife, not just condors, but yeah.
Very powerful, the shooting lobby, though, in the States.
Yeah, definitely.
I had enough trouble in this country getting anglers to stop using lead.
But what I just find extraordinary that there's still an argument about lead, and I just don't get it at all. That, you know, I mean, don't get me started. I mean, you can get me started if you want, but talking about lead just boggles how anybody could look at a neurotoxin and say, yeah, let's knowingly feed it to our children. Let's go out shooting on the weekend. Not that I have anything against shooting, but let's intoxicate some food with lead and feed it to our children. That's got to be a good idea, hasn't it?
Well, it's a bit like putting up the plumbing to deliver the water to our kids in 30, 40 years ago.
You know what's scary about the lead ammunition argument? If you go back 40 years, right, and if you look at the rhetoric, the syntax, and the wording that was used by the smoking lobby and the leaded petrol lobby, the wording is almost exactly the same. The same tactics, same rhetoric, same words, just change lead for petrol, change lead for smoking. It's almost exactly the same. It's terrifying, really. And how it's not been, but anyway, don't get me started. I find it extraordinarily frustrating.
Thank you.
Rob,
Sorry, Rob.
I had up.
Yeah.
Campbell, you said that the white-headed vulture is more of a predatory species. So does that make it less susceptible to poisoning and give it a better chance in the future?
Yes, I think it does. The unusual feeding ecology is that they are predatory, but the males tend to be more predatory. From the little we know, they're more predatory than the females. So the female is bigger, more aggressive, and probably attends carcasses more often than males do. And when they come to a carcass, they fight more with other vultures. They eat more faster than the males and the juveniles. So as a species, yes, I think the risk is lower from poisoned carcasses. As individual birds, I think the females are within the species are at higher risk because they attend carcasses more often and so are more likely to be poisoned.
Right. Thank you.
Male white-headed vultures are pretty soft, really. So the females they really want, they turn up and they just go for it. They hate white-backed vultures. They'll turn up and just beat them up just for fun. Honestly, they come to a carcass and they'll beat them up and not even eat anything. They just come for the fight. Great.
Have you got any plans down the line to satellite track or similar any of the juveniles for white-headed vultures?
Yeah, we've got this. We've already tracked some birds. We've got. The problem is that the density of the birds is really low. So and capturing them is really quite difficult because they don't come. Like I just saying, they don't come to carcasses that much. And in my view, there's only certain age classes of birds that interest me. So with colleagues in Mozambique, where we in Gorongosa, and we had a field site in central Mozambique, Kruger birds from KZN in southeastern South Africa. So the data set's small, but it's growing. It's just because there's just not many white-headed vultures and trapping them's difficult and transmitter. We've got one male white-headed still going in central Mozambique. He's been going for 3 years now. It's just one bird, so and not that useful. Interesting, but not that useful. Yeah.
Right. There might be some little nuggets of information on dispersal eventually. Which,
But this bird is like a pinball inside. It just doesn't move. Inside the national park, and he's just bounces around in there. That's what he does. Yeah, slowly we want to answer those questions. but as usual, need more data.
Are there any more questions?
You must all be starved for company if you're still talking to me, really.
We are at this stage.
I'm flippant. I'm Australian. I'm flippant. I'm sorry. So.
Well, it's nice to spend an evening with such a large number of people. It's a rarity. Well, we can probably let you off the hook in that case very shortly. That's been a fascinating pair of talks. Very grateful for your time and company.
You're welcome.
Yep. I think that's probably the end of business for us this evening. Then there are just a couple of things which I have been reminded to mention, and one is the date of the next meeting, which was on the slides, but that's 2 weeks' time, which is the 3rd of March, I think. Is that right? Yeah,
yes.
I'm looking at an actual paper calendar next to me, so it must be true. 3rd of March, Birds by Habitat with, I've forgotten the name of the speaker, but it has been on the slide.
Yes.
Carl Chapman.
Carl Chapman, thank you. And the last date of entry for the photo competition is the same week, the Friday the 5th. So still got a couple of weeks for photo competition entries, which we'll look forward to seeing.
May I share one picture, Chris?
Please do.
This one. Can you see that?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the male hanging around in the background. This is the female. She's just arrived, and she's footing this white-backed vulture for no reason. She's just rocked up. Look at the difference you see. So whenever they fight, they flash their wings. So this really strong contrast between black and white. My theory is that they have these white secondaries here, like this, as an enhanced threat gesture when they come to a carcass, which makes them more effective when they fight at a carcass. The males don't do it. So females, they'll spread their wings and lunge 3 to 4 times more often at a carcass than a male will. Spread their wings like this. Anyway, just thought I'd share that one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very striking looking birds.
Beautiful. Yeah.
The male doesn't have the white, does it, on the second?
No, they're either grey or sort of they're rather dull actually, or just like a grey. Sometimes not even only grey, sort of.
Well, in a few years' time, hopefully we can look forward to a talk on why the white-backed vulture has white backs.
Oh, no. It's like a blister on my brain, that one. So.
That'd be good. Okay. Well, in that case, we'll see you all in a couple of weeks. Thank you again, and nice to see everyone.
Thank you very much, Campbell. That was excellent.
I was going to say,
yes, the usual round of applause.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been good fun. So I hope you've enjoyed it. So.